It's February 1917. You're standing at your frost-covered window in Petrograd and something is wrong. The women are marching. Not just a few, but thousands, mothers, wives, daughters, flooding the streets of the Russian capital, demanding bread, demanding peace, demanding that anyone remember that people need to eat. You can hear them now, their voices rising like a tide. Bread, peace down with autocracy. You don't know it yet, but you're about to witness the collapse of a 300-year dynasty. The Tsar, who seemed untouchable yesterday, will abdicate within days. The empire that stretched from Europe to the Pacific will shatter and rebuild itself. And you, an ordinary citizen worried about your next meal, you're about to become part of the most dramatic political transformation in human history. Welcome to a journey through history where the impossible becomes inevitable, where ordinary people discover they have the power to topple emperors, and where asking for bread becomes the first step toward changing the world. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Pull your blankets close, let your breathing slow. If you're new here, welcome to our corner of history where great events unfold through intimate human moments. And if you enjoy these nighttime journeys through the past, a gentle light helps other history lovers find these stories. You wake to the familiar bite of February cold seeping through the thin walls of your modest apartment on Vasilyevsky Island, one of the many islands that make up the sprawling city of Petrograd, like pieces of a puzzle that Peter the Great designed but never quite finished. The wooden floors creak under your feet with the particular sound that old buildings make when they're trying to hold warmth. Against a Russian winter, a gentle groaning that speaks of wood that has expanded and contracted through decades of seasons, creating a symphony of survival that plays every morning as the city awakens. Through the frost-etched glass of your small window, you see the Neva River, partially frozen in patterns that look like nature's own calligraphy, as if winter itself has been writing messages in ice that only those who know how to read suffering and beauty simultaneously can understand. The river's surface catches what little sunlight filters through the perpetual grey of a Petrograd winter sky, throwing it back in sharp flashes that create moments of brilliance in a world that has grown accustomed to various shades of grey. Ice fishermen have cut holes in the frozen sections of the river, their dark figures standing patient as monks against the white landscape, waiting for fish that may or may not come, embodying the kind of hope that has learned to endure disappointment without losing faith entirely. Across the water, the golden spire of the Peter and Paul Cathedral pierces the grey sky like a needle, threading hope through despair, a reminder of the Petersburg that Peter the Great envisioned a window to Europe, a city of grandeur and ambition, where Russian culture would marry Western ideas and create something entirely new. But the Petersburg you inhabit in 1917 feels more like a city holding its breath, waiting for something that everyone senses is coming, but no one can quite name. The grandeur remains in the architecture, the wide boulevards and imposing facades that speak of imperial confidence. But the people who move through these spaces carry themselves differently now, with the particular posture of those who have learned that impressive buildings and imperial proclamations provide little protection against the practical realities of hunger and cold. Your apartment is small, but represents a kind of sanctuary in a world that has become increasingly unpredictable. 2 rooms that you share with the sounds and smells of a dozen other families in the building, each unit carved from what was once probably a single grand residence, now subdivided into living spaces for people who work with their hands and worry about rent and food with the consistency of prayer. The main room serves as both kitchen and sitting area, dominated by the brick stove in the corner that you fed with precious coal before bed last night. Each piece of coal represents a careful calculation. Warmth now against warmth, later comfort today against survival tomorrow. The mathematics of winter in wartime Petrograd require constant optimization, the kind of resource management that would impress any university economics professor, except that failure in this course means freezing rather than just receiving a poor grade. The walls are painted a faded yellow that might once have been cheerful, but now simply speaks of better times when fresh paint seemed important enough to afford, when people had the mental energy to care about aesthetics because their basic needs were reliably met. The paint itself tells a story, layers applied over decades, each one representing a moment when someone believed the future would be brighter than the present, when investing in beauty seemed like a reasonable gamble against an uncertain world. A simple icon of St. Nicholas hangs near the door, not because you're particularly devout in any formal sense, but because in times of uncertainty, even the skeptical find comfort in familiar rituals, in the presence of symbols that have provided comfort to previous generations who faced their own versions of impossible circumstances. The saints' painted eyes seem to watch over your daily struggles with the patience of someone who understands that miracles come in many forms, sometimes as large as the transformation of entire societies, sometimes as small as finding bread when the shops are empty, sometimes as simple as maintaining hope when hope requires more effort than despair. On your small wooden table, scarred by years of use and marked by the rings left by countless glasses of tea, sits yesterday's copy of Wretch, the liberal newspaper that dares to criticize the government in language carefully coded to avoid the attention of the secret police, while still managing to convey truths that everyone understands, but few dare speak aloud. Its headlines speak of military defeats that feel as distant as the moon, tens of thousands of Russian soldiers lost in battles with names you can barely pronounce, fighting for objectives that no one seems able to explain in terms that make sense to people whose primary concern is finding enough food to survive the week. The newspaper itself represents a small miracle of persistence, the fact that people continue to print and distribute information, even when that information is consistently depressing, even when the authorities make clear that certain kinds of truth-telling are unwelcome. Each edition represents an act of faith that knowing what's happening is better than not knowing, even when what's happening is terrible, even when knowledge brings its own forms of pain. You dress in layers a skill you've perfected over many Russian winters, and refined further during this winter of particular hardship. The process has become a ritual of preparation for battle against a world that has grown increasingly hostile to human comfort. First, wool stockings that itch but provide essential warmth. Their rough texture, a constant reminder that comfort has become a luxury rather than a reasonable expectation. Over these, a cotton chemise that's been mended so many times, it's more patches than original fabric. Each repair representing a moment when you chose to make do rather than do without, when you decided that functionality mattered more than appearance. The stitches tell stories, hasty repairs made by lamplight after long days, careful work done during conversations with neighbors, neat patches applied with the pride of someone who refuses to let circumstances diminish their self-respect. Next, a wool dress that's seen better seasons but still serves its purpose, its fabric thin in places but still capable of keeping wind and cold at bay. The dress carries memories woven into its fibers, occasions when it was new, and you felt properly dressed times when you've worn it to celebrations and funerals, to work, and to the rare social gatherings that still happen despite everything. Finally, your heavy coat, the most important piece of your winter armor against a world that has grown cold in more ways than one. This coat belonged to your father, and it still carries the faint scent of his tobacco mixed with machine oil, from his years working in the factories before the arthritis in his hands made such work impossible. Wearing it connects you to his memory, but also to his practical wisdom. He bought the best coat he could afford because he understood that surviving Russian winters requires serious preparation. In the coat's deep pockets, you feel the weight of the few rubles you have left, precious metal discs that represent the mathematics of survival in a city where prices change daily and always upward, where the value of money seems inversely related to the value of the goods it's supposed to buy. The coins are warm from your body heat, and touching them has become a nervous habit, a way of reassuring yourself that you still possess some small measure of agency in a world that often seems designed to eliminate individual choice. Along with the coins, your fingers find your ration card worn soft from handling its corners, bent from the countless times you've presented it to shopkeepers who shake their heads and explain with expressions of genuine sympathy that yes, you have the right to buy bread, but no, there is no bread to buy. The card represents the government's acknowledgement that people need food, but also its failure to ensure that food is actually available, a perfect symbol of a political system that has mastered the appearance of caring without achieving the substance of effective action. Today, like every day, for the past several months, your first task will be finding bread. Not good bread, not fresh bread, not the kind of bread that makes a meal a pleasure rather than a necessity, but simply bread. Any bread that can fill the hollow space in your stomach and provide the energy you need to face another day in a city that seems to be slowly consuming itself, burning through its resources and its people's patience with equal efficiency. The search for bread has become more than just a daily necessity. It's become a form of political education, a way of learning about the relationship between government promises and individual reality. Every morning, you join a community of searchers, people who have developed informal networks of information about which shops might have flour, which bakers might have received shipments, which rumors might be worth investigating. As you step into the hallway, you encounter the familiar sounds and smells of communal living, the sensory landscape of people making do with less space and fewer resources than any individual family would choose, but more community and mutual support than most people in better circumstances ever experience. The building's wooden floors creak under the weight of a dozen families beginning their daily routines, each family's morning sounds blending into a symphony of survival that plays every day. The scrape of pots on stoves, the murmur of voices discussing the day's plans, the cry of babies who don't understand why their mother's milk has grown thin. Somewhere below, you can hear the Volkov baby crying with the particular intensity that speaks of hunger rather than mere discomfort. A sound that's become as regular as a clock marking the hours with infant need that mirrors the adult hunger of everyone in the building. The baby's cry has become a kind of baseline note in the building's daily music, a reminder that the crisis affecting everyone is perhaps most clearly expressed in the voices of those too young to understand why their basic needs are not being met. You nod to Maria Petrovna, your elderly neighbor, who's already wrapped in her thick shawl, preparing for the same daily pilgrimage to the bread shops that defines life for everyone in your social class. Her weathered face mapped with lines that speak of surviving the famine of 1891, the revolution of 1905, and countless winters when politics mattered less than warmth, crinkles into a weary smile that somehow manages to suggest that experience has taught her the difference between temporary difficulties and permanent despair. Another beautiful morning for waiting in line, she says with the kind of humor that only comes from too much practice at making light of hardship, her voice carrying the accent of the countryside, though she's lived in the city for 30 years. Some connections to the land never fully disappear, and in Maria's speech you can hear echoes of a Russia that exists beyond the political dramas of capitals, a Russia of seasons and harvests, and the practical wisdom that comes from living close to the cycles of nature. "At least the snow is pretty," you reply, pulling your coat tighter and checking that your scarf covers your neck, completely eliminating any gap where cold might find entry. Makes the city look like a fairy tale. A fairy tale where the princess is very, very hungry. Maria chuckles and you both laugh. The kind of laughter that keeps despair at bay, the sound of people who refuse to let circumstances rob them of their humanity or their ability to find moments of lightness in even the heaviest situations. Though I suppose even fairy tale princesses had to eat. They just had magic to help them find food. Maybe that's what we need, you suggest, as you both begin the careful descent down the narrow wooden stairs, each step a small negotiation with gravity and the building's age. A little magic, or a new government, Maria says quietly, then glances around as if the walls might be listening, though her tone suggests she's not entirely joking about the possibility that they might be. In Imperial Russia, even casual criticism requires caution, but the level of caution required has been decreasing as the government's competence has become increasingly questionable. You descend the narrow wooden stairs together, each step creaking a familiar tune that speaks of age and wear, but also of stability. These stairs have survived revolutions, wars, famines, and political upheavals, and they continue to serve their simple purpose of connecting one floor to another. There's something comforting about this permanence in a world where everything else seems subject to change without notice, where the only reliable constant seems to be the unreliability of everything else. The building's entrance hall smells of cabbage soup, old wool, and the faint sweetness of wood smoke scents that have become the perfume of working-class Petrograd, the olfactory signature of people making do with what they have, rather than what they might prefer. These are not unpleasant smells. They speak of life continuing, of people creating warmth and nourishment from whatever materials they can gather, of communities sharing what little they have, because sharing often makes the difference between survival and surrender. Outside, the morning air hits your face like a gentle slap from nature itself, clean and sharp with the promise of more snow, cold enough to make your eyes water, but also invigorating in the way that reminds you that you're alive, that you've survived another night, that you have the strength to face another day of challenges that would have seemed impossible to manage just a few months ago. The cold is intense enough to be immediately noticeable, but there's also something clarifying about it, the kind of cold that strips away everything non-essential and focuses your attention on the immediate requirements of existence. In this cold, abstract political theories matter less than practical strategies for staying warm. Philosophical debates about the nature of government become less important than the immediate question of where to find bread. The streets are already alive with purpose as you step out into the morning air, joining the steady stream of people who have learned to move through the city with the efficiency of those who understand that every moment spent in warmth is a moment not spent in cold every minute of walking. Quickly is a minute closer to the front of whatever line you're trying to join. The sight of your neighbors bundled against the cold in whatever combinations of clothing they've managed to accumulate over the years creates a visual reminder that individual survival has become a collective project. You join the steady rhythm of dozens of others all heading in the same direction toward the bread shops that may or may not have bread, toward the daily gamble that defines survival in wartime Petrograd. Your footsteps crunch in the snow with a sound that has become as familiar as your own heartbeat, joining the percussion section of an orchestra made up of people who have learned to find beauty in the most mundane necessities of existence. The sound echoes off the buildings lining the street, creating a symphony of survival that speaks to the resilience of ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. Each footstep represents a choice to continue to persist, to believe that tomorrow might offer what today has withheld. The collective sound of all these footsteps creates a rhythm that has become the heartbeat of revolutionary Petrograd, not the dramatic boom of artillery or the clash of sabers, but the quiet persistence of people who refuse to give up. As you walk down Bolshoi Prospect, the broad avenue that serves as one of the main arteries of Vasilyevsky Island, you notice how the city wears its troubles like an ill-fitting coat, obvious to anyone who looks but worn, with a dignity that refuses to be diminished by circumstances beyond individual control. The architecture still speaks of imperial grandeur, but the grandeur seems hollow now, like a beautiful shell that has lost whatever gave it meaning. Shop windows that once displayed fine goods from across the Russian Empire, silk from China, spices from Central Asia, crafted items from the skilled workshops of Moscow and Kiev, now show mostly empty shelves or apologetic signs explaining shortages in language that grows more creative and desperate with each passing week. The shopkeepers have become poets of scarcity, finding new ways to explain why what people need is not available while maintaining the politeness that keeps communities functioning despite shared frustration. The bakery you're heading to allegedly still has flour, according to yesterday's intelligence from Pavel Mikhailovich, though the price has climbed again, and the quantity available decreases each day like a tide, going out so slowly that you notice the change only when you look back at where the water used to be. These rumors of bread have become a form of currency themselves, information traded between neighbors, shared in whispered conversations, passed along with the understanding that today's truth might be tomorrow's disappointment. The network of information about food availability has become more sophisticated than many government intelligence operations, a grassroots system of communication that demonstrates how quickly people can organize when their survival depends on it. Women share knowledge about which shops might have received shipments, which bakers might have access to black market flour, which rumors are worth investigating, and which are the products of wishful thinking. You pass a group of workers from the Putilov factory, men whose faces have been set with the particular kind of tiredness that comes from both physical labor and empty stomachs from trying to maintain productivity when your body lacks the fuel necessary for sustained effort. Their heavy coats, patched and repatched over multiple winters, hang loose on frames that have grown thinner over the months of inadequate nutrition. They speak in low voices about their shifts, about the rumors of more shortages, about letters from the front, where their brothers and sons fight in a war that grows more meaningless with each passing month. Each casualty report, each description of battles fought for objectives that make sense only to generals who will never have to explain to mothers why their sons died for a village whose name they can't pronounce. The German offensive near Minsk says the eldest of the group, a man whose greying beard and calloused hands speak of decades spent in the foundries, shaking his head in the slow way of someone processing information too terrible to fully accept all at once. They say we lost another 50,000 men in 3 days. 50,000 just gone, like they never existed. My nephew was in that offensive. Another worker adds his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking louder might make the information more real than he can bear. Haven't heard from him in 2 weeks. His mother sits by the window every day watching for the postman, hoping for letters that might never come. 50,000, the first man repeats quietly, his breath forming clouds in the cold air, the visible manifestation of words that seem too heavy for the morning to carry. That's more people than live in our entire district, an entire community worth of fathers and sons and brothers wiped out in 3 days for strategic objectives that will probably be abandoned by the time the newspapers report the victory, if they even bother reporting it as a victory. And for what? Asks a third man, younger than the others, but with eyes that seem older than his years, eyes that have seen too much of the machinery of war and too little of its purpose. So the Tsar can add another medal to his collection, so the generals can move their pins around on their maps and feel like they're accomplishing something important, while real men die for their strategic theories. My brother writes from the Romanian front, contributes another worker pulling his thin coat tighter against the wind. Says they're using cavalry charges against machine gun nests. Cavalry charges like this is still the 18th century, like horses can outrun bullets. The officers order it from trenches 5 miles behind the lines, then write reports about the brave sacrifice of the cavalry when every horse and rider gets cut down in the first 30 seconds. While their own families go hungry, adds the first speaker, his voice carrying a bitterness that speaks of personal experience with the mathematics of wartime sacrifice. While we're told to tighten our belts for the war effort, while our children learn to count ration cards instead of counting games. My daughter asked me yesterday why we can afford to send bullets to Germany, but we can't afford to buy bread for Russian families. What did you tell her? Asks the youngest worker, genuinely curious about how to explain such contradictions to children who still expect the world to make sense. I told her that's a very good question, and when she grows up, maybe she'll help find a better answer than the ones we've been given. The conversation pauses as they all contemplate the weight of their shared frustration, the accumulation of individual grievances that has begun to feel like collective injustice, requiring collective response. You overhear this exchange and feel the familiar knot in your stomach, not just from hunger, which has become as constant as breathing, but from the weight of a world that seems to be crumbling at the edges, while those in power insist that everything is proceeding according to plan. These numbers, 50,000 dead, hundreds of thousands wounded, entire regiments, disappearing into the meat grinder of modern warfare. They represent real people, individuals who once stood in bread lines, just like this one who once worried about coal for their stoves and food for their families, who once planned futures that will now never happen. Yet somehow, in this moment, with the snow falling gently and the familiar rhythm of your neighbors around you, there's also something strangely comforting about the shared struggle. You're not facing these challenges alone. You're part of a community that has learned to support each other through circumstances that would break individuals, but somehow strengthens groups. The solidarity born from shared hardship has created bonds that transcend the differences that might divide people in easier times. The bread line, when you reach it, stretches around 2 blocks, a testament to both the scarcity of bread and the persistence of hope, a physical manifestation of the gap between what people need and what the current system can provide. The line has become its own social institution, a place where neighbors catch up on news, where information is shared and strategies are developed, where the community maintains its cohesion despite the pressures trying to tear it apart. People have organized themselves with the efficiency that comes from practice, creating an informal system of place-holding and information sharing that would impress any government bureaucrat if government bureaucrats spent time studying how communities actually function when left to their own devices. The line represents democracy in action, not the theoretical democracy of political speeches, but the practical democracy of people organizing themselves to solve immediate problems. You take your place behind a young woman holding a baby, both of them bundled so thoroughly against the cold that only tiny pink cheeks are visible above the layers of blankets and scarves like nested dolls, where the innermost doll is a human face expressing the patience that only infants and those who care for them can master. The baby sleeps peacefully despite the cold with the enviable ability of the very young to find rest anywhere, any time, under any circumstances. How long have you been waiting? You ask the young mother, who turns to you with a smile that manages to be both tired and warm, the expression of someone who has learned to find companionship in shared hardship rather than letting hardship isolate her from human connection. Since before dawn, she replies, shifting the baby to her other arm with the practiced efficiency of someone who has learned to manage infant care while navigating the practical demands of survival in wartime. My husband works the night shift at the Baltic shipyard, so I take the early bread duty while he sleeps. We've learned to divide the labor. He handles the factory work. I handle the domestic supply chain management. Her use of the term supply chain management to describe standing in bread lines draws a smile from you. It's the kind of humor that transforms necessity into choice, that suggests agency even in circumstances that seem to offer little room for individual decision-making. She nods toward an older woman near the front of the line, a figure so bundled in shawls and coats that she looks like a walking collection of textiles rather than a person. Vera Nikolaevna. There she's been here since yesterday evening. Brought a blanket, and everything turned bread waiting into an overnight camping expedition. She says, if you're going to spend your life waiting for something, you might as well get comfortable while you do it. The image of someone camping out overnight for bread strikes you as both tragic and admirable. Tragic because it represents the extremes to which ordinary people have been pushed. Admirable because it represents the lengths to which they're willing to go to care for their families. Vera Nikolaevna has transformed what could be seen as degrading necessity into a form of dedication that commands respect. You settle in for the wait, pulling your coat closer and watching your breath create small puffs of vapor that dissipate quickly in the cold air. Each exhalation a visible reminder that you're alive, that your body continues to function despite the challenges it faces, that hope persists even when conditions suggest it shouldn't. This is your life now, the daily mathematics of survival, calculated in hours, weighted rubles spent, and calories consumed. Yet somehow, in this line with your neighbors, sharing quiet conversations and small kindnesses, it doesn't feel quite as desperate as it might. The community that has formed around shared hardship provides a kind of wealth that doesn't appear on any government economic statistics, the wealth of mutual support, of shared information, of collective endurance that makes individual survival possible. The conversation around you flows like a gentle stream touching on practical matters that have become the substance of daily life, where to find coal that won't bankrupt you, whether the rumors about the fish market having actual fish are worth the long walk across the city. What the latest newspaper headlines mean for ordinary people who have learned to read between the lines of official announcements. These conversations gradually expand to larger questions that seem to hang in the air, like the snow clouds overhead. Questions that people are beginning to ask more openly as the gap between official promises and daily reality becomes too large to ignore. When did it become normal to spend more time searching for food than eating it? When did the exceptional become routine? When did survival become a full-time occupation? As the morning progresses and the weak sun climbs higher in the grey sky, struggling to provide illumination if not warmth, the bread line evolves into its own small society. A microcosm of the Russian Empire itself, complete with its own social hierarchies, informal rules, and emerging political consciousness that develops organically from shared experience rather than theoretical instruction. You've moved perhaps 20 steps forward in 2 hours, a rate of progress that would be frustrating if anyone still expected efficiency from any aspect of daily life. But you've learned the life stories of half a dozen neighbors and heard second-hand news from every district of the city. The breadline has become an informal university where people receive education in economics, politics, and social organization simply by standing together and sharing what they know. Behind you, Pavel Mikhailovich, a clerk from the Ministry of Finance, whose threadbare coat speaks of government salaries that haven't kept pace with wartime inflation, whose knowledge of how money actually moves through government bureaucracy provides insights that no newspaper could offer, shares his theory that the food shortages are not entirely accidental. His fingers stained with ink from years of copying documents and calculating figures that never seem to add up in favor of ordinary people gesture as he speaks. Keep them focused on bread, he whispers conspiratorially, leaning close enough that you can smell the cheap tobacco on his breath, the kind of tobacco that poor people smoke when they need the comfort of familiar rituals but can't afford the luxury of quality. Keep them spending all their time and energy on basic survival, and they won't have time or energy left to think about freedom, about justice, about the fact that their government is completely incompetent. You really think it's deliberate? Asks an older woman who has joined the conversation, her voice carrying the skepticism of someone who has learned to question simple explanations for complex problems. You think they're creating shortages on purpose? Pavel nods grimly. I see the paperwork, the budget allocations. Money that should go to grain purchases gets redirected to military contracts. Trains that should carry flour to cities carry ammunition to the front instead. It's not that they can't feed people, it's that feeding people isn't their priority. Or maybe, suggests the young mother in front of you, rocking her baby gently as she speaks, her voice carrying the practical wisdom of someone who has learned to see, through official explanations to underlying realities, there really is no bread because the government spent all the grain money on bullets and artillery shells. Hard to feed people when you've converted all the wheat into gunpowder money and sent it to the front to be blown up in someone else's country. Both can be true, observes a middle-aged man who has been listening quietly, his weathered hands marking him as someone who works outdoors despite the winter. They chose war over welfare, and now they're choosing to blame the people for being hungry instead of admitting they made the wrong choice. This observation draws nods of agreement from several people within earshot, creating the kind of moment when individual insight becomes collective understanding. The mathematics of war versus welfare has become a topic of general discussion among people who 6 months ago would never have presumed to question government spending priorities, but who now find themselves forced to become economists simply to understand why their children are hungry. My husband keeps the books for a grain warehouse, adds a woman whose worn shawl and careful posture suggests someone who has learned to maintain dignity despite economic hardship. He says they have orders to hold grain until prices reach certain levels. The warehouse owners get richer while families get hungrier. It's not shortage, it's speculation. Speculation with people's lives, mutters Pavel, his clerk's understanding of bureaucracy, lending authority to his anger. I process the export permits. Russia sends grain to other countries while Russians starve. We're feeding Germany's allies while our own people queue for hours hoping to buy a loaf of bread. The revelation creates a moment of silence as people process the implications of what they're hearing. The idea that their suffering has been engineered for profit rather than resulting from genuine scarcity transforms individual frustration into collective anger, personal hunger into political awareness. You pull out the small folding stool you've learned to bring to these daily vigils, a piece of advice from Maria Petrovna that has saved your back from hours of standing and transformed bread waiting from an endurance test into something almost resembling comfort. The metal is cold even through your gloves, but sitting feels like luxury after 2 hours on your feet in the snow, and the stool serves as both practical accommodation and social signal. The stool also marks you as a veteran of breadlines, someone who has learned the unwritten rules of survival in wartime Petrograd and adapted successfully to circumstances that would have seemed impossible to navigate just a few months ago. Other experienced waiters nod approvingly at your practical preparation, while newcomers to the Breadline Society look at your setup with the mixture of admiration and envy reserved for those who have figured out how to make the unbearable slightly more bearable. The conversation around you shifts like the wind, moving from immediate practical concerns to larger philosophical questions about how society organizes itself and why some ways of organizing work better than others. These aren't abstract academic discussions. They're urgent practical considerations for people who are experiencing the failure of one system and trying to imagine what a better system might look like. My husband writes from the Austrian front, says a woman with prematurely grey hair streaking from beneath her wool cap, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of something hot that steams in the cold air, creating a small, personal cloud of warmth in the larger coldness of the morning. Says the soldiers are sharing not just boots but rifles now. Two men to a rifle taking turns shooting at the enemy when they can figure out who the enemy actually is. Two men to a rifle. Pavel shakes his head slowly as if trying to process information that doesn't quite fit into any reasonable understanding of how wars are supposed to work, how modern states are supposed to function, how governments are supposed to care for their own people. And meanwhile, the officers still have their heated tents, and their imported cognac still receive regular meals, while their men hunt for scraps. The Tsar's family adds an elderly man whose military posture suggests former service, whose knowledge of military protocol makes his criticism carry extra weight. Still takes photographs in their luxury train car, still plays dress-up in expensive uniforms while their subjects play hunt for bread in the capital city of the empire they're supposed to be governing. You notice how these conversations develop organically, each person contributing a piece of information or perspective that builds into something larger than any individual complaint. What emerges is not just criticism of specific policies, but a growing awareness that the entire system might be fundamentally broken, that the problems people face daily are not aberrations or temporary difficulties, but symptoms of structural failures that require structural solutions. A commotion near the front of the line draws everyone's attention, creating the kind of focused silence that spreads through crowds when something important is about to happen, when individual attention combines into collective awareness that transforms a group of separate people into a community with shared interests. The baker emerges from his shop floor, dusting his apron like fresh snow, and he holds up his hands for quiet with the weary gesture of someone who brings the same disappointing news every day, but continues to do so because someone has to be the messenger between systemic failure and individual need. My friends, he calls out, his voice carrying the particular exhaustion of someone caught between sympathy for his customers and the harsh realities of wartime economics, someone who understands that he represents the human face of an economic system that has stopped working for most people. I have bread for perhaps 50 people today. The flour shipment from Moscow was delayed again. The pause before delayed carries volumes of meaning. Everyone understands that delayed might mean anything from transportation problems to theft to simple bureaucratic incompetence, but the result is the same regardless of the cause. A collective sigh rises from the line like steam from a samovar, the sound of people processing disappointment that has become so routine it's almost comforting in its predictability. 50 people. You count quickly, estimating your position at roughly 70th in line, doing the mathematics that everyone in line is doing simultaneously. The calculation is simple and brutal. You will not eat bread today. But instead of anger or despair What you observe around you is a weary kind of acceptance that has become as familiar as the cold mixed with something new. A growing awareness that this situation is not natural or inevitable, but created by specific decisions, made by specific people who could make different decisions if they chose to do so. This is February 1917 in Petrograd, the daily disappointment that somehow never quite becomes hopelessness because tomorrow there might be flour, tomorrow there might be bread, tomorrow the world might arrange itself differently, and if not tomorrow, then someday because the current arrangement is clearly unsustainable. Well, says the young mother in front of you, shifting her baby to her other arm, with the practiced efficiency of someone who has learned to adapt to constant disappointment while maintaining enough optimism to keep trying. At least we got some fresh air and good conversation out of the deal. Plus, we're all learning valuable lessons about economics and resource distribution. Pavel laughs a short bark that fogs immediately in the cold air. Good conversation and empty stomachs. The breakfast of revolutionaries served with a side of political education and garnished with growing awareness that things don't have to be this way. He says it as a joke, but something in his tone makes you look at him more carefully. His eyes, you notice, aren't quite laughing with his mouth. There's something harder there, something that speaks of patience, finally reaching its limits of acceptance, transforming into action. As the line begins to disperse, slowly, reluctantly, like people leaving a warm house for a cold journey, you overhear fragments of conversations that seem to carry more weight than usual. These aren't the resigned complaints of people accepting their fate, but something different, something that hums with potential energy, waiting for the right moment to transform into kinetic force. And meeting tonight at the Viborg factory, they say there might be news about organizing. My cousin works at the garrison, says the soldiers are asking questions about orders about who they're supposed to protect. And from what? If they can't even feed us, why should we keep feeding them our taxes, our sons, our patients? International Women's Day! Next week, they say there's going to be something special, something bigger than just asking for bread. These conversational fragments float around you like the snowflakes, and you find yourself collecting them without quite meaning, to your mind automatically cataloguing information that might be important later, storing details that don't seem significant now, but might prove crucial when circumstances change. Later, you'll remember this moment as the day you first heard the word revolution, spoken not as a distant possibility or a historical concept that happens to other people in other times, but as something that might happen here in your city in your lifetime, involving people like you who have learned that ordinary citizens possess more power than they realized when they decide to act together. Walking home, empty-handed but somehow not empty-hearted, you notice how the city looks different when you're not focused solely on your own individual hunger, when you start seeing your personal struggles as part of a larger pattern that affects everyone around you. The imperial double-headed eagles on government buildings seem smaller, less intimidating, more like decorations than symbols of absolute power, more like props in a play than instruments of real authority. The police officers look tired rather than threatening, as if they too are wondering where their next meal will come from, as if they too have families affected by the same shortages that bring you to bread lines every morning. Even the snow-covered statues of former czars appear almost temporary, as if the snow has revealed something that was always true, but previously invisible, that these monuments to absolute power are just stone and metal, no more permanent than the snow that covers them, no more eternal than the political system they represent. The walk home takes you through the heart of Petrograd, past buildings that house the machinery of empire government offices, where clerks process the paperwork of administration while wondering if their salaries will keep pace with food prices, banks where the mathematics of war debt compound daily, while the human cost of war compounds even faster, military headquarters, where generals move pins on maps representing thousands of lives, while those lives write letters home describing conditions that make no sense to anyone who remembers what civilization is supposed to accomplish. But today, these buildings feel less imposing. Their authority somehow diminished by your morning's education in the breadline university. Maybe it's the snow which makes everything look smaller, and more human scale reducing imperial grandeur to human proportions. Maybe it's the conversations you've just experienced which have reminded you that you're part of a community larger than your individual struggles, part of a collective intelligence that's beginning to understand how power actually works. Or maybe it's simply that hunger, when shared with enough people, stops feeling like a personal failing and starts feeling like a political problem with political solutions that might be within reach of people who have learned to organize themselves effectively enough to wait in breadlines with dignity and mutual support. You return to your apartment building to find Maria Petrovna sitting on the stairs, peeling what appears to be the last potato in Petrograd, with the careful attention of someone who understands that every scrap of food represents a victory against circumstances designed to defeat ordinary people, each curl of potato skin a testament to the art of making something from very little. No bread? She asks, though your empty hands already tell the story that has become so familiar it hardly requires words. No bread, you confirm, settling beside her on the step with the gratitude of someone who has learned that human warmth and companionship cost nothing but mean everything. But Pavel Mikhailovich thinks there might be something happening. Something bigger than just bread shortages, something that might actually change the underlying conditions that create bread shortages. Maria considers this information while her weathered hands continue their careful work, with the potato peeler creating ribbons of skin so thin they're almost transparent waste, so minimal, it approaches artistry. You know, she says finally, her voice carrying the weight of someone who has lived through enough history to recognize its patterns to understand when individual problems become collective movements. I lived through the 1905 uprising. Started with workers wanting bread, and wages started with people asking for basic fairness from employers and government. How did it end? Well ended with change. Not enough change maybe, but change nonetheless. People learned something that year, learned that they didn't have to accept everything just because it came from above, learned that even czars have to pay attention when enough people speak at once with voices that refuse to be ignored. The memory seems to animate her, bringing color to her cheeks and energy to her voice as she recalls a time when ordinary people discovered their collective power. The strange thing about that year was how quickly everything happened once it started happening. For months, people complained individually about problems that seemed impossible to solve. Then suddenly they started complaining together, and impossible problems started looking like difficult problems that might have solutions. Do you think it could happen again? She looks at you with eyes that have seen much, survived more, and learned to hope carefully, but hope nonetheless. Child, when people spend more time in bread lines than in their own homes, when soldiers write letters about sharing boots while fighting wars, nobody can explain when the Tsar's wife consults mystics while the people starve. She lets the sentence hang in the air, like wood smoke, letting you draw your own conclusions. When that happens, that's when history starts to bend. That's when the impossible becomes merely difficult, when the unthinkable becomes thinkable, when ordinary people discover they have more power than they realized. You sit together in comfortable silence, sharing the warmth of proximity and the subtle electricity of possibility that seems to be building in the air, like the static charge that comes before a thunderstorm. The stairwell around you carries the sounds of your neighbors going about their evening routines, children playing games that involve imaginary food, adults discussing the day's disappointments in voices that grow more political as they grow more frustrated. The elderly Mr. Volkov practicing his violin with the patient persistence of someone who finds beauty even in circumstances designed to discourage it. Outside, through the building's front door, you can hear the city settling into evening routines that have become exercises in creative problem-solving. Footsteps in the snow mark the paths of people finding new ways to accomplish basic tasks when the old ways no longer work. Voices call to each other across courtyards, sharing information about where to find coal, where someone might have vegetables, how to repair boots when leather has become too expensive to replace. But underneath these familiar sounds, there's something else, a frequency of anticipation, a sense that tomorrow might bring something different from the endless repetition of disappointment that has defined recent months. It's not exactly hope, which feels too fragile for the circumstances, but something more durable, the recognition that the current situation cannot continue indefinitely, and that when it changes, ordinary people like you might have more influence over the direction of that change than anyone in power imagines. That evening, you find yourself in the communal kitchen of your building, where the thin walls and shared spaces make privacy impossible and community inevitable, where individual survival has become a collective project managed through the sharing of resources, information, and moral support. The room is warm with human presence and the heat from several small stoves, creating a microclimate of comfort in a world that has grown increasingly hostile to human comfort. The samovar steams in the corner, its gentle bubbling providing a comforting soundtrack to the conversations that flow around the long wooden table, like water finding its course through a landscape shaped by shared experience. The table itself bears the scars of communal use knife marks from years of food preparation, water stains from countless shared meals, burn marks from hot pots placed by tired hands. It's not beautiful furniture by any conventional standard, but it's functional and welcoming, worn smooth by the touch of neighbors who have learned to depend on each other in ways that would have seemed impossible in easier times. Dmitry Sergeyevich, who works at the Baltic shipyard and whose hands are permanently stained with metal shavings that no amount of scrubbing can completely remove, sits across from you, nursing a glass of weak tea. His massive hands, more accustomed to handling heavy machinery than delicate teacups wrapped around the glass, as if drawing warmth from its meager heat, while drawing comfort from the community it represents. The workers at Putilov walked out today. He announces quietly, though in this kitchen, quietly is relative, since the sound carries to everyone present, which is perhaps the point. Started as a dispute about wages that haven't kept pace with food prices, but ended with speeches about the war, about why we're fighting it, about who benefits from it continuing. How many workers, asks Anna Viktorovna the seamstress, looking up from her mending with the sharp attention of someone who understands that numbers matter when assessing the significance of labor actions.
Nearly all of them. 40,000 men just stopped working, put down their tools and walked out into the snow. Dimitri's voice carries amazement at his own words. I've never seen anything like it. Not just a few troublemakers or union organisers, but everyone. Even the foremen, even the clerks who usually cross picket lines.
What did the managers do? T.T. Pavel asks, his bureaucratic background making him curious about official responses to unofficial actions. Nothing at first. I think they were too shocked to react. Then they started making threats about firing everyone, but you can't fire 40,000 people and still run a factory. Besides, who would they hire to replace them? Everyone in the city has the same complaints. Maria Petrovna, who's managed to create a surprisingly fragrant soup from her single potato and some mysterious vegetables she acquired through the complex barter networks that keep neighborhoods fed when official distribution systems fail, looks up from her bowl with the sharp attention of someone who understands that labor disputes can become political movements without anyone planning for such transformation. Speeches about the war or speeches about ending the war. She asks her spoon, pausing halfway to her mouth as she waits for an answer that might help her understand which direction events are moving. Both. Neither. Does the distinction matter anymore? Dmitri shrugs, but his eyes suggest it matters very much indeed. When a man hasn't eaten properly in months, when his wife is selling her wedding ring for coal, when his son writes letters from trenches that might become his grave, when he's working longer hours for wages that buy less food each week. Well, the difference between complaining about the war and wanting to end it gets pretty thin. My son-in-law was there, adds Vera Semyonovna, setting down her tea glass with the careful precision of someone who has learned that even small luxuries like hot drinks deserve respect. Says the speeches weren't just about wages or working conditions. People were talking about the whole system, about why we have a government that can organize armies but can't organize food distribution. What kind of speeches? You ask, genuinely curious about how political consciousness develops in practical settings. One man, a welder my son-in-law said, stood up and asked why the factory makes artillery shells for the army but can't make plowshares for farmers. Said we have the skills and the machinery to build anything we need, but we only build things that destroy rather than things that create. The kitchen grows thoughtful as people consider this observation, the silence filled only with the samovar's gentle bubbling and the distant sound of wind against windows. Around the table, you see the faces of your neighbors, people you've shared countless meals and conversations with, people whose children have played together in the courtyard, people who have lent each other everything from salt to sorrow, and you realize you're all thinking the same thing. When did it become normal to speak this way about government policy? When did criticism of fundamental social arrangements become as common and acceptable as complaints about the weather? Another worker, Dmitri continues, talked about his brother at the front, says his brother's regiment was ordered to attack a German position with bayonets because they didn't have enough ammunition. Bayonets against machine guns. The officer who gave the order was promoted for his aggressive spirit. The soldiers who followed it are dead. Promoted for getting his own men killed. Pavel mutters, shaking his head with the particular disgust of someone who has seen how bureaucratic incentives can reward failure and punish competence. That's when things got political, Dmitri says. People started asking why we have officers who view their own soldiers as expendable, why we have a government that treats its citizens as expendable, why we accept a system where the people who make the decisions never face the consequences of those decisions. My nephew works at the telegraph office, contributes Vera Semyonovna, an elderly woman whose husband died in the Japanese War 12 years ago, and who has raised 3 children on a widow's pension that wouldn't feed a family cat. Says messages from the front arrive faster than messages from the palace, as if the government cares more about what the Germans are doing than what their own people need. He reads the cables, not supposed to, but he does, and he says the generals write more reports about enemy movements than about their own casualties. She speaks this observation in the tone of someone sharing interesting gossip, rather than making a political statement, but everyone in the kitchen understands the implications. A government that pays more attention to its enemies than its citizens has perhaps forgotten which poses the greater long-term threat to its survival. It's like they're managing an empire for someone else's benefit, suggests Pavel, who has joined the evening gathering after his shift at the Ministry of Finance, bringing with him insider knowledge of how government actually functions when viewed from the perspective of someone who processes the paperwork. All the resources flow toward the war effort, toward maintaining international prestige, toward keeping up appearances on the world stage, while the people who actually live here are treated as an afterthought. Who benefits from the war continuing, asks Anna Viktorovna her question, carrying the practical curiosity of someone who has learned to follow money and power to understand political decisions. Arms manufacturers for one, Pavel replies immediately. The companies that make weapons and ammunition have government contracts that guarantee profits regardless of whether the war is won or lost. Some of them have contracts that actually pay more if the war lasts longer. Banks that lend money to the government, adds Dmitry. Every month of war means more debt, and more debt means more interest payments. Some people get richer while the country gets poorer. Foreign allies who want Russia to keep fighting so they don't have to fight alone, suggests Maria. Britain and France benefit from every Russian soldier who dies fighting Germans because that's one less German soldier they have to face themselves. The conversation has evolved from complaints about immediate hardships to analysis of systemic problems, from personal grievances to political understanding. These neighbours gathered around a kitchen table to share thin soup and weak tea have become a political education circle, without meaning to developing insights that university professors might envy. You sip your own tea hot water with the memory of tea leaves sweetened with hope rather than sugar, and listen to the rhythm of revolution being born in ordinary conversations between ordinary people who have been pushed beyond the limits of what ordinary people should be expected to endure. These aren't the grand philosophical discussions you might imagine changing the world. They're practical considerations spoken by practical people who've discovered that their practical problems have political causes and might therefore have political solutions. Through the thin walls, you can hear similar conversations from other apartments, other buildings, other neighborhoods. The sound layering upon layer until the entire city seems to hum with the frequency of change, as if the very architecture is absorbing the tension and preparing to broadcast it back into the streets when the moment arrives for words to become actions. There's talk of a demonstration. Dmitry says his voice, dropping even lower though the conspiratorial whisper, only makes everyone lean closer and listen more intently. International Women's Day, March 8th. According to the new calendar the government keeps trying to make us use. Nothing seditious, they say. Just women asking for bread. Women asking for bread, Maria repeats thoughtfully. But there's something in her tone that suggests she understands this might be like calling a wildfire just a match. International Women's Day. I remember when that was just an excuse for men to buy flowers and feel progressive for 24 hours. Still could be, suggests Pavel, though his tone indicates he doesn't believe this himself. Except there are no flowers to buy, and asking for bread has become a political act, whether you intend it that way or not. When basic human needs become political issues, everything becomes political. The conversation continues to flow around the table, touching on practical matters that have become the substance of political education, where to find candles when darkness comes early, and electricity has become unreliable, whether the rumors about a meat delivery to the market district have any basis in reality or are simply the product of collective wishful thinking, how to keep apartments warm when coal costs more than rent, and wages haven't kept pace with either. But underneath these immediate concerns runs a deeper current of possibility, a growing awareness that individual survival strategies might be less effective than collective action, that personal problems shared by enough people become political problems that require political solutions. You find yourself studying the faces around the table, people you've known for months or years, but are seeing with new clarity, wondering which of them might be thinking what you're thinking, that tomorrow's demonstration might be more significant than anyone is planning but that the simple act of women asking for bread might catalyze changes that extend far beyond food distribution. You can see it in the way Dimitri's hands tighten around his tea glass, when he talks about the factory workers, in the way Maria's eyes brighten when she mentions the women organizing, in the way Pavel glances toward the window as if he can see the future approaching through the snow like a storm system that will transform the landscape once it passes through. My daughter says her teachers are talking about joining, mentions Anna Viktorovna, a seamstress whose fingers are permanently pricked from years of emergency alterations that keep families dressed as circumstances grow more difficult. Not to make trouble, they insist, just to support the women who work in the factories, to show solidarity with people who are facing the same problems they face. Solidarity repeats the elderly Mr. Volkov, testing the word as if it's a new piece of music he's learning to play, examining its tonal qualities and harmonic possibilities. When I was young, we called it helping your neighbors. Same thing, I suppose, just sounds more important when you give it a fancy name that suggests it might be part of something larger. The observation draws gentle laughter around the table, but also thoughtful nods. Perhaps all political movements begin with the simple human impulse to help neighbors, and only acquire grand names and theoretical frameworks later, when people try to explain to themselves how they manage to change the world without quite meaning to. March 8th dawns grey and cold, but with a quality of light that suggests winter might eventually remember that it's supposed to end, that the cycles of nature continue even when human affairs seem stuck in patterns of repetition that resist change. The sky has that particular pewter colour that promises snow, but also hints at the possibility of sun breaking through if the day develops enough momentum to push the clouds aside and reveal whatever lies beyond the grey ceiling that has covered the city for weeks. You wake not to your usual alarm of cold seeping through the walls, but to the sound of voices in the street, not the usual morning shuffle of people heading to bread lines with the resigned patience of habit, but something different. Something that carries the cadence of purpose rather than resignation, the rhythm of people who have decided that today will be different from yesterday in ways that extend beyond the mere hope that there might be bread when they reach the front of the line. The voices rise and fall like music. Fragments of conversation and laughter mixing with the sound of footsteps that seem to have more energy than usual, more direction, more intention. Through your frost-covered window, you can see figures moving with a sense of purpose that's been absent from the streets for months. People walking, not just to survive another day, but to participate in something larger than individual survival, something that might transform survival from a daily struggle into a reliable expectation. You dress carefully, adding an extra layer against both the cold and the uncertainty of the day ahead, but also with the awareness that today you're not just dressing for the weather, you're dressing to be part of history, though you wouldn't use such grand language to describe it to yourself. You're simply dressing to join your neighbors in asking for something that should be simple, but has proven complicated: food for families, peace for soldiers, dignity for people who work hard and deserve better than constant anxiety about meeting basic needs. Your heaviest coat, the one that belonged to your father and still carries the faint scent of his tobacco mixed with machine oil from his years working in the factories before arthritis made such work impossible, provides not just physical warmth but emotional connection to previous generations who faced their own challenges and found ways to persevere. Warm boots that pinch slightly but keep snow out completely tested through weeks of breadline waiting. A scarf that covers your neck and can be pulled up over your mouth if the wind picks up, transforming you into someone ready for whatever the day might require. As you step into the hallway, you find it already filled with your neighbors, all preparing for something none of you can quite name, but all of you seem to understand intuitively. The air hums with nervous energy and anticipation, the feeling of people who have made a collective decision without quite realizing they were making a decision at all, who have agreed to participate in something larger than themselves without fully understanding what that something might become. Bread and Roses, Maria Petrovna says as she adjusts her best shawl, the one she usually saves for religious holidays, now being pressed into service for what might become a different kind of sacred occasion. That's what they're calling for in other cities. Bread for our bodies, roses for our souls, basic necessities and human dignity wrapped together in demands that shouldn't be revolutionary, but have become so. I'll settle for just the bread, you reply, but you're smiling as you say it, and Maria laughs, the kind of laughter that suggests that maybe, just maybe, both might be possible. Though I suppose roses would be nice too once we figure out the bread situation and establish that people shouldn't have to choose between food and beauty. One revolution at a time, she responds with the practical wisdom of someone who has learned to manage expectations while maintaining hope, who understands that lasting change happens gradually, even when it appears to happen suddenly. The streets of Petrograd on this March morning feel electric in a way you've never experienced, as if the city itself has been plugged into some source of energy that's been absent for months, as if the collective decision of thousands of people to stop accepting the unacceptable has created a field of possibility that makes the air itself feel different. As you walk toward Nevsky Prospect, the great boulevard that serves as the city's main artery and has witnessed every significant event in the city's history, you join streams of women flowing from every district, every neighborhood, every corner of the city. They carry signs made from scraps of wood and torn fabric with words painted in whatever they could find, house paint, chalk, even charcoal mixed with snow. The messages are simple and direct. Bread, peace, down with autocracy, feed the children. Some signs are more creative, reflecting the wit that emerges when people refuse to let desperate circumstances diminish their humanity. We want bread, not bullets. And hungry women make angry citizens, and the Tsar eats while Russia starves. One particularly clever sign carried by a woman whose ink-stained fingers mark her as a typist or clerk reads, "We demand the right to be bored by ordinary problems instead of terrified by extraordinary ones." Another, held by a factory worker whose overalls are visible beneath her coat, declares, "Equal pay for equal work and equal bread for equal hunger." But what strikes you most profoundly isn't the signs or the slogans, it's the faces. These are the faces you see every day in bread lines, in communal kitchens, in the endless queues that define survival in wartime Petrograd. But today they wear expressions you haven't seen in months, maybe years. Determination mixed with hope, anger balanced by solidarity, exhaustion transformed into energy by the simple magic of shared purpose and collective action. There's something almost festive about the atmosphere despite the serious nature of the demonstration. Women laugh as they march, sharing jokes and stories, creating bonds that transcend the differences of class and education that might divide them under normal circumstances. A group of factory workers walks arm in arm with teachers and clerks, their different backgrounds united by shared experience of rationing and sacrifice. You find yourself walking beside a young woman about your age, her cheeks flushed with cold and excitement, her eyes bright with the kind of energy that comes when people discover they have more power than they realized. She carries a baby on her hip, the same baby from the breadline you realize, the one who sleeps so peacefully despite the chaos of the world into which he was born. And somehow, the child's presence makes the whole demonstration feel both more urgent and more hopeful, as if the future itself is being carried along with the crowd.
"Are you scared?" you ask her, as the crowd grows thicker around you, voices blending into a river of sound that flows through the city streets like water that has finally found its proper course after being dammed up for too long.
She considers the question seriously shifting the baby to her other arm with the practiced efficiency of someone who has learned to think clearly while managing the practical demands of infant care, who has developed the ability to participate in historical moments while maintaining responsibility for daily necessities.
I was scared yesterday, waiting for bread that never came, she says, finally, her voice carrying clearly despite the noise around you. I was scared last week, reading my husband's letter from the front, where he wrote about watching his friends die for reasons no one can explain to their satisfaction. I was scared this morning, wondering if participating in this demonstration might get me arrested, might leave my baby without a mother.
She pauses, adjusting the baby's blankets against the cold, before continuing. But then I realized I'm more scared of the world I'll leave for him if I don't participate. I'm more scared of teaching him to accept injustice than I am of fighting against it. I'm tired of being scared of the wrong things. Her answer surprises you with its clarity, and you realize she's articulated something you've been feeling without being able to put into words. Fear has become so constant, so much a part of daily experience, that it's lost its usefulness as a guide to behavior. When you're afraid of hunger and cold and war and loss every day, when fear becomes the background noise of existence, the fear of asking for change begins to seem quite manageable by comparison. What's his name? You ask, nodding toward the baby. Mikhail, she replies with a smile that transforms her face. Named for his grandfather who died in the Japanese War. I want him to grow up in a world where being named for dead soldiers isn't considered normal, where children are named for their possibilities rather than their families' losses. Around you, similar conversations are happening throughout the crowd. Women sharing their reasons for marching, their hopes for their children, their growing awareness that individual problems shared by enough people become political problems that might have political solutions. The demonstration has become a mobile community, a traveling workshop in democracy, where people discover their own political voices simply by using them. The demonstration flows through the city like a river, finding its course growing larger and stronger as it encounters the tributaries of support flowing from side streets and apartment buildings, from factories where women have left their machines to join the march, from schools where teachers have decided that today's lesson will be taught in the streets rather than in classrooms, from offices where clerks have determined that filing papers for a government that can't feed its people is less important than demanding that government learn how to fulfill its basic responsibilities. You pass the shops with their empty windows, their apologetic signs explaining shortages in language that has grown more creative and desperate over the months. The shopkeepers stand in their doorways, some watching with sympathy, others with worry, a few with the kind of calculation that suggests they're trying to determine which way the political wind is blowing before deciding whether to support or oppose what they're witnessing. You pass government buildings with their imperial eagles monuments to an authority that feels less intimidating when you're surrounded by hundreds of people who have decided to question it. Some of the eagles have been draped with red cloth by previous demonstrators, transforming symbols of imperial power into advertisements for popular revolution. Office workers peer from windows, their faces showing curiosity, sympathy, and sometimes envy for people who have found the courage to act on frustrations that everyone shares. And everywhere, women join the stream. Factory workers, still covered in machine oil, their hands bearing the permanent stains of industrial labor, but their faces bearing expressions of dignity that no amount of industrial grime can obscure. Clerks from government offices carrying their dignity like armor, even as they challenge the system that employs them. Teachers who have spent months trying to educate children too hungry to concentrate, now participating in a different kind of education that takes place in the streets rather than in classrooms. Mothers carrying their children like flags of the future, they're demanding like living symbols of why the present arrangement of society needs to change. Near Palace Square, where the Winter Palace stands as a symbol of imperial power that suddenly seems less permanent than it did yesterday, you encounter your first line of police. They stand in formation looking uncertain, as if they've prepared for many things, but not for the sight of thousands of their own mothers, wives and daughters asking politely but firmly for bread, as if their training never covered how to respond when the people you're supposed to control refuse to accept control, but also refuse to become violent. Their uniforms look crisp and official, but their faces show the confusion of men who have been trained to maintain order, but have never been told what to do when order breaks down, not through violence or chaos, but through the simple refusal of ordinary people to accept extraordinary deprivation as normal and inevitable. The crowd doesn't push forward aggressively. Instead, it simply continues to arrive, growing larger and more impossible to ignore with each passing minute, demonstrating the kind of power that doesn't depend on force, but on persistence, on the accumulated weight of people who have decided that their individual problems are actually collective problems that require collective solutions. You watch the faces of the police officers and see something you don't expect: sympathy. These men too have families who wait in bread lines. They too receive letters from the front describing conditions that make no sense to anyone who remembers what civilization is supposed to look like. They too struggle with wages that don't keep pace with food prices, with the daily anxiety of not knowing whether they'll be able to provide for their families. Let them pass. You hear one officer say to another, his voice carrying the weight of someone making a decision that feels both official and personal. They're not armed with anything but empty stomachs and reasonable demands. Orders are orders, replies a younger officer, but his voice lacks conviction, as if he's reciting a lesson he learned by rote, but has never had to apply in circumstances that test its relevance. Orders from who to do what? Arrest half the city for asking for food. The older officer shakes his head with the gesture of someone who has reached the limits of what orders can reasonably require. Some orders stop making sense when you try to follow them in the real world. The demonstration moves like water around the police cordon, neither confronting nor retreating, simply flowing toward the center of the city, where power lives in palaces and decision-makers work in heated rooms, while making decisions about people they never have to look in the eye, people whose faces they never have to see, when their policies create suffering. As the morning progresses, something unprecedented begins to happen. Men start joining the demonstration. First, just a few husbands who've followed their wives, fathers who understand their daughters' hunger, brothers who've decided that watching history happen is less satisfying than participating in it. Then workers from factories who have walked off their jobs, students from universities who have left their books, clerks from offices who've decided that filing papers for a government that can't feed its people is less important than standing with people who are demanding to be fed. By noon, what began as International Women's Day has become something larger. The day Petrograd decided it was tired of being hungry, tired of sending sons to die in wars that make no sense, tired of accepting that the richest country in the world somehow can't manage to feed its people or govern itself competently. The crowd now includes thousands of people, all moving with the shared understanding that today is different from yesterday and tomorrow must be different from today. The energy is palpable but not violent, focused but not angry, determined but not desperate. This is not the fury of a mob, but the resolve of a community that has discovered its own power. The snow that falls on this demonstration doesn't feel cold. It feels like confetti at a celebration you didn't know you were invited to. Each flake seems to carry messages of support from the sky itself, as if nature approves of people asking for the basic necessities of life, as if the universe has been waiting for this moment when ordinary people would finally refuse to accept extraordinary suffering as their normal condition. Standing in Palace Square, surrounded by more people than you've ever seen in one place, feeling the energy of collective action that transforms individual powerlessness into group strength, you realize that history isn't something that happens to other people in other times. It's something that happens to ordinary people who decide on an ordinary day that becomes extraordinary to stop accepting the ordinary injustices that have shaped their lives. The revolution, you understand with sudden clarity, has begun, not with grand declarations or military coups, but with women asking for bread and men deciding to stand with them, with neighbors becoming comrades and strangers becoming allies in the simple, radical act, refusing to go hungry while others feast, of refusing to accept that poverty is inevitable in a world of abundance. As the afternoon sun struggles through the clouds, casting long shadows across Palace Square, like fingers reaching towards something just beyond grasp, like nature itself, trying to touch the history being made below, you witness something that will be remembered long after the snow melts and the breadlines disappear, the moment when the Imperial Army decides which side of history it wants to inhabit, when the instruments of state power choose conscience over commands. The first soldiers arrive in formation, their boots echoing against the cobblestones, with the precise rhythm of military discipline that has been drilled into them through months of training designed to make obedience automatic, to create human machines that respond to orders without question or hesitation. They carry rifles with bayonets fixed to steel, catching what little sunlight filters through the clouds and throwing it back in sharp flashes that create a visual reminder of the potential for violence that hovers over every confrontation between citizens and state. For a moment, the crowd grows quiet, not with fear exactly, but with the recognition that this moment will define everything that follows. The demonstrations up to this point have felt almost festive, despite their serious purpose. But the arrival of armed soldiers transforms the atmosphere, introducing the possibility that the state might respond to requests for bread with bullets, that the government might choose to maintain order through violence rather than addressing the conditions that made disorder seem necessary. You're close enough to see the faces of individual soldiers, and what you observe there surprises you profoundly. These aren't the faces of men prepared for battle. They're the faces of men who recognize their own families in the crowd before them. Young faces, mostly boys, who look barely old enough to shave, let alone make life and death decisions about their own citizens. Their eyes carry the uncertainty of people who have been trained for one situation, but find themselves in another entirely. The commanding officer, a middle-aged man with a grey moustache that speaks of decades of service, and a bearing that suggests he's accustomed to being obeyed without question, raises his hand for the crowd's attention. The square falls silent except for the wind and the distant cry of ravens, creating a theatrical quiet that makes everyone acutely aware of the historical weight of the moment, of the fact that what happens next will be remembered by people who haven't been born yet. Citizens of Petrograd. His voice carries across the square, formal but somehow uncertain, as if he's following a script written for a different play, trying to apply procedures designed for different circumstances. You are ordered to disperse and return to your homes. This gathering is unauthorized by the imperial government and threatens public order. The response comes not as a shout or a challenge, but as something more powerful. A question asked by an elderly woman near the front of the crowd, whose voice carries the authority of someone who has raised children and buried husbands and survived famines. Someone who has earned the right to question authority through decades of submission that has yielded little benefit. And where, officer, should we go to authorize our hunger? The question hangs in the cold air like a physical thing, visible as the breath that carries it and substantial as the stones beneath everyone's feet. You watch the officer's face change as he processes not just the words, but the absolute reasonableness of them, the logical impossibility of ordering people to stop being hungry when the systems responsible for feeding them have failed. Behind him, you see soldiers shifting their weight, glancing at each other, each man individually reaching the same conclusion that their officer is reaching. That some situations cannot be resolved through military discipline, that some problems require solutions that don't appear in any training manual. We have our orders, the officer says, but his voice has lost its authority, becoming the voice of someone reciting lines he no longer believes, someone trying to maintain a performance when the audience has stopped playing their assigned role. And we have our empty stomachs, calls another voice from the crowd, a woman holding a child who looks too thin for his age, whose presence serves as a visual reminder that this is not an abstract political discussion, but a practical matter of life and death. Which do you think is more urgent, your orders or our children's hunger? What happens next occurs so gradually that later, when people try to describe it to friends and family and historians, they'll struggle to identify the exact moment everything changed. It starts with one soldier, a young man who looks barely old enough to be away from his own mother, lowering his rifle. Not dramatically, not as a gesture of defiance, but simply letting it rest at his side, as if it's suddenly become too heavy to hold at attention, as if the weight of the weapon has somehow increased, when he realized he might be expected to use it against people who look like his own family. Then another soldier does the same, and another. The movement spreads through the formation like ripples in water, each man making an individual decision that becomes part of a collective transformation, each personal choice contributing to a historical moment that none of them planned but all of them create together. The officer turns to address his men, and you're close enough to hear him say, "Remember your duty to the Tsar." But his words sound hollow, even to him, as if he's trying to invoke magic that has lost its power, trying to use authority that has been undermined by circumstances that make the very concept of duty more complicated than military training ever acknowledged. The young soldier who first lowered his rifle looks up at his commander with eyes that seem older than his years, eyes that have seen too much of what war actually accomplishes and too little of what it's supposed to achieve. "Sir," he says, quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the strange acoustics of the square. "My mother is probably in this crowd, my sister definitely is, my duty to them comes first." And then something extraordinary happens. The crowd begins to sing, not a revolutionary anthem or a patriotic hymn, but Mnogaya Leta, the song of long life, traditionally sung for the Tsar, but somehow in this moment becoming a prayer for the life of the people themselves. The melody rises from hundreds of voices, creating harmonies that speak of shared culture and common hope of the possibility that traditions can be transformed rather than destroyed. The soldiers, one by one, begin to remove their caps. Some wipe their eyes with their sleeves, whether from cold or emotion, it's impossible to tell. A few step forward, crossing the invisible line between order and conscience, between following commands and following their hearts, between serving the state and serving the people who are the state. The commanding officer stands alone now, his authority dissolved like snow in warm water. He looks at his men, then at the crowd, then back at his men, and you see in his face the exact moment when he realizes that some situations cannot be resolved through military discipline, that some problems require solutions that acknowledge the humanity of everyone involved. Finally, he too removes his cap, running his hand through graying hair, with the gesture of a man accepting a defeat that feels more like liberation than failure.
"I cannot order you to fire on your own families," he says, and his words carry across the square like a declaration of independence, not from Russia, but from the idea that following orders is more important than following conscience, that loyalty to abstract institutions matters more than loyalty to real people.
The crowd doesn't cheer or celebrate. Instead, they simply open their arms and welcome the soldiers among them. You watch young men in uniform being embraced by women old enough to be their grandmothers being offered the warmth of solidarity, even though there's no bread to share, no material comfort to provide, except the knowledge that they've chosen correctly when forced to choose between orders and humanity. This is the moment you realize when the revolution becomes irreversible. Not because of any dramatic battle or violent confrontation, but because the instruments of power have chosen to join the people they were meant to control. An army that will not fire on its own citizens is no longer an army in any meaningful sense. It's a group of armed citizens, and that changes everything about the relationship between government and governed. The transformation feels almost magical in its completeness. One moment you're looking at the familiar confrontation between authority and dissent, between state power and popular protest. The next moment, you're witnessing the birth of something entirely new, a community that includes both civilians and soldiers, both those who ask for bread and those who are sent to deny it. As evening approaches and the crowd begins to disperse, not in defeat, but in victory, not because they've been driven away, but because they've achieved something important and need time to understand what it means. You walk home through streets that look the same as yesterday, but feel completely different. The buildings still stand where they've always stood. Their windows still glow with lamplight, the river still flows toward the sea, with the patience of water that has witnessed the rise and fall of empires. But something fundamental has shifted in the relationship between those who rule and those who are ruled. And you can feel it in the way people walk, in the way they talk to each other, in the way they look at the symbols of authority that only yesterday seemed so permanent. Groups of soldiers and civilians walk together through the streets, engaged in conversations that would have been impossible yesterday, discussing questions that have suddenly become practical rather than theoretical. What kind of government do we want? How should society organize itself? What does it mean to serve the people rather than serving those who rule the people? In your small apartment that night, as you light your meager fire and prepare for sleep, you can hear the city humming with a new frequency. Conversations float through the walls, excited voices discussing what happened today, what it means, what might happen tomorrow. Someone is playing a balalaika in a courtyard, the music mixing with laughter, and the sound of people discovering that they have more power than they realized, that change is not only possible, but happening. You make a simple dinner from the few provisions you have bred, from yesterday's successful expedition, which now seems like it happened in a different world. Tea that's mostly hot water, a bit of cheese that tastes like celebration because it's being eaten on a day when something genuinely important happened. As you eat, you think about the soldier who said his duty to his family came first, about the officer who could not order men to fire on their own people, about the moment when an army became a collection of citizens choosing conscience over commands. The revolution has kept its promises, though not in ways anyone could have predicted. There is peace, at least here in the capital, though it's the peace of resolution rather than submission. There is bread, or at least the reasonable expectation that there will be bread tomorrow, now that the people who control food distribution understand they answer to the people who need food. There will be changes, though what those changes look like remains to be determined by people who are still learning what it means to have power. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new complications, new questions about what happens when a people reclaim their power from those who have been exercising it in their name, but not for their benefit. There will be negotiations and political maneuvering, competing visions of what the new Russia should look like, practical problems of governing a vast empire in the middle of a devastating war. But tonight, for the first time in months, you fall asleep not thinking about bread lines or empty stomachs or letters from the front describing horrors that make no sense to rational people. Tonight you fall asleep thinking about possibility, about the future that's being born in the space between what was and what might be, about the extraordinary things that happen when ordinary people decide they've had enough of accepting the unacceptable, about the moment when powerlessness transforms into power through the simple act of people standing together and refusing to be ignored. 3 days later, you wake to a sound you haven't heard in months. Church bells ringing in celebration rather than mourning, their bronze voices carrying across the city with news that seems too large for any individual to hold completely. But as you listen more carefully, pressing your ear against the cold window glass, while your mind tries to process what your ears are telling you, you realize they're not ringing for any religious holiday marked on the traditional calendar.
They're ringing because somewhere between your falling asleep last night and waking this morning, the impossible has become inevitable. The unthinkable has become reality. The world has transformed itself in ways that will be studied by historians for centuries, but can only be understood in the moment by people who lived through the gradual accumulation of small changes that suddenly became one enormous change.
Tsar Nicholas II has abdicated. The news spreads through your building like water through a broken dam, carrying with it fragments of information, disbelief, excitement, and uncertainty. Doors open and close with unusual frequency as neighbors seek each other out to confirm what they've heard, to make sure they're not dreaming, to verify with their own eyes and ears that the world has indeed transformed overnight. Footsteps echo in hallways as people move with the particular urgency of those who understand they're living through a historical moment but don't yet understand what that moment means. Voices carry fragments of the story that seems too large for any individual to hold completely: the Tsar's isolation in his military headquarters, his general's refusal to support him, his final decision to step down rather than fight a civil war. He couldn't win. Each person who shares the news adds their own interpretation, their own emotional response, their own understanding of what this change might mean for their daily life. You dress quickly in the grey morning light, your fingers fumbling with buttons and laces in your eagerness to join the stream of neighbours flowing into the street, all of you drawn by the magnetic pull of historical moment, all of you needing to verify with your own eyes that the world has indeed changed as dramatically as the church bells suggest. Outside, Petrograd has metamorphosed into something you barely recognize, as if the city has shed an old skin and emerged as a new creature entirely. The imperial double-headed eagles that crowned government buildings for centuries have been covered with red cloth or removed entirely, leaving empty spaces that speak more eloquently of change than any new symbol could. Red banners hang from windows like flowers blooming in an unexpected spring, each one representing someone's decision to declare their allegiance to a future that doesn't include the Romanov dynasty. Groups of people cluster around anyone who claims to have official news, though in this moment the line between official and rumor has become beautifully irrelevant. Information flows through the crowds like water, finding its leveled stories about the Tsar's final hours of power, about telegrams between Petrograd and army headquarters, about generals who finally refused to support a monarchy that could no longer command the loyalty of its own soldiers. The very architecture seems different, as if buildings constructed to house absolute power have suddenly become uncertain about their purpose. Government offices that yesterday represented the weight of centuries of tradition today look like ordinary buildings that happen to have impressive facades. The transformation is not physical, but psychological. The change is in how people look at these buildings, how they move through the spaces around them, how they understand their own relationship to the power these buildings once represented. You find Maria Petrovna standing outside the bakery, the same bakery where you've spent so many fruitless hours in line, where the mathematics of hunger have dominated your mornings for months. Today, though, there's something miraculous, actual bread in the window. Loaves of real bread displayed like jewels in a shop window, catching the morning light, and looking almost too good to be true. The baker himself stands in the doorway, no longer the apologetic figure who delivered daily disappointment, but someone transformed by the events of the past few days. His flour-dusted apron is clean, his face carries a satisfaction you haven't seen before, and behind him the shelves that were empty for months now display an abundance that seems almost magical. How, you ask, amazed by the transformation that seems to have occurred overnight, by the sudden appearance of abundance where scarcity has ruled for so long. Turns out, Maria says with a grin that takes years off her weathered face, that makes her look like someone who has just received confirmation that the world makes sense after all. There was always bread, warehouses full of it, enough to feed the entire city for months. Just took a revolution to free it from the profiteers who were hoarding it, waiting for prices to climb even higher, while people starved outside their doors. The baker nods his expression, mixing relief with anger. They came yesterday morning, workers from the docks, soldiers who joined the people, and they opened the warehouses, found enough grain to feed every family in Petrograd for the rest of the winter. Mountains of flour stored in buildings I didn't even know existed. Where were these warehouses, you ask, trying to understand how such abundance could exist so close to such want? All over the city, and the baker replies, counting on his flour-dusted fingers. One near the Finland station, another by the river docks, a third in the Vyborg district. Some of them were disguised as regular buildings, others were hidden behind false walls. The grain speculators had created an entire hidden infrastructure of artificial scarcity. The revelation hits you like a physical blow, the kind of truth that rearranges your understanding of everything that came before. All those mornings in bread lines, all those days of hunger, all those nights falling asleep with empty stomachs, and there was bread all along, locked away by people who saw starvation as a business opportunity rather than a human tragedy, who understood that scarcity creates profit and therefore had no interest in ending scarcity. My nephew was part of the group that opened the warehouse near the docks. Maria continues, her voice carrying both pride and anger. Says they found records showing the owners were planning to wait until spring, when prices would be even higher, before releasing any grain to the market. People were supposed to starve through the winter so a few merchants could afford better summer houses. What happened to the owners? You ask, wondering about the fate of those responsible for so much suffering. Most of them fled when they heard the revolution had started, the baker says. Loaded their personal belongings onto trains and disappeared, leaving their warehouses behind. A few tried to argue they were just following normal business practices, but normal business practices don't include watching children starve while you sit on mountains of food. You buy actual bread, warm, fragrant, substantial bread that feels almost impossibly heavy in your hands, and for a moment you simply hold it, marveling at its weight and reality, trying to understand how something as basic as bread could feel revolutionary. The crust is golden and crisp, the kind of bread you remember from childhood, but had almost forgotten existed. When you break it open, steam rises from the soft interior, carrying the scent of grain and yeast and possibility. When did bread become miraculous? When did something as fundamental as feeding yourself become a political act? The answer, you realize, is when someone decides that profit matters more than people eating, when basic human needs become commodities to be manipulated for financial gain, when the abundance that should serve everyone is hoarded by a few who benefit from everyone else's desperation. The revolution gave us our bread back, says a woman who has joined the conversation, her arms full of groceries that would have been impossible to obtain just days ago. But more than that, it taught us that we don't have to accept scarcity as natural when abundance has been there all along. As you walk through the city eating bread that tastes like victory, that carries flavors you had forgotten, food could have you encounter scenes that will live in your memory forever. Former government officials walking quietly through crowds that ignore them rather than attack them. The ultimate dismissal being treated as irrelevant rather than threatening. Their expensive coats and confident bearing from just days ago have been replaced by nervous glances and hurried steps, as if they understand that their authority depended on people's acceptance rather than their own inherent power. Police officers removing their imperial insignia and replacing them with red ribbons, transforming themselves from agents of the old order into servants of something new and undefined. Some seem genuinely relieved to make the transition, as if they've been waiting for permission to serve the people rather than the system. Others look uncertain, unsure of what their role should be in a world where authority flows from popular consent rather than imperial decree. Street vendors who disappeared during the worst of the shortages have reappeared with goods that seem to vanish from the city entirely. A woman selling apples from a cart explains that she had hidden her stock when the police started arresting vendors for speculation, but now feels safe displaying her wares again. The revolution made it safe to sell food instead of hoarding it, she says simply. Children play new games in squares where just days ago their parents stood hungry and afraid. They play at being revolutionaries and provisional government ministers, acting out the drama they've witnessed with the seriousness of people who understand they're rehearsing for roles they might actually fill someday. Their games are more sophisticated than adult political theories because children understand intuitively that power is something you do not, something you have. One group of children has organized a mock bread distribution system with designated roles for bakers, customers, and fair distribution officials who ensure everyone gets their share. They've created a better system in an hour of play than the government managed in months of administration because their game assumes cooperation rather than competition as the normal state of human relations. In Nevsky Prospect, you come upon a group of workers reading aloud from a newspaper, their voices competing with the wind and traffic, but somehow managing to create an impromptu public forum where political education happens through the simple act of sharing information, where literacy becomes a tool of liberation rather than just personal advancement. The headline in bold letters that seem to shout from the page, "The people's will has triumphed." Listen to this. Calls out the reader, a man whose hands still bear the permanent stains of factory work, whose voice carries the authority of someone who has learned to speak for others as well as himself. A provisional government has been formed under Prince Lvov. They promise elections, they promise constitutional monarchy, they promise an end to the secret police, they promise workers' rights and women's suffrage. Constitutional monarchy, Tani repeats, someone in the crowd thoughtfully. What does that mean exactly?
Means the Tsar, or whoever replaces him, has to follow laws like everyone else, explains a woman who identifies herself as a teacher. Means the government answers to elected representatives instead of making decisions in secret. Means people have rights that can't be taken away just because someone in authority feels like taking them away.
Promises, mutters someone in the crowd, a woman whose skeptical tone suggests she's heard political promises before and watched them dissolve when circumstances made them inconvenient. Politicians' promises are like snow, beautiful when they fall, but they melt when the weather changes. But this time is different, argues a young man whose student's clothing marks him as someone from the university. This time, the promises are being made by people who know the people can overthrow them if they break their word. That changes the incentive structure completely. The skepticism is warranted, you think, but for now it's balanced by something more powerful, the simple fact that change has proven possible. 3 days ago, the idea of Tsar Nicholas II's abdication seemed as likely as snow in July. Today, it's yesterday's news already being superseded by new questions about what kind of country Russia will become, what kind of society people want to build together. You spend the day wandering through a city that's reinventing itself by the hour, discovering new possibilities in familiar spaces. Workers' councils, Soviets, spring up in factories and neighborhoods like mushrooms after rain, each one an experiment in democracy, happening in real time. People who've never spoken in public find themselves making speeches in courtyards and markets, discovering that they have opinions about governance and the confidence to express them. Democracy, it turns out, is messy and loud and beautiful and terrifying, often all at the same time. Meetings happen everywhere, in factory floors, cleared of machinery, in apartment courtyards where neighbors debate the future, in restaurants where the waiters join the customers in discussing how to organize a society from scratch. The conversations are passionate but civil, heated but respectful, urgent but patient enough to let everyone speak who wants to speak. That evening you attend an impromptu meeting in your building's courtyard, where Dmitry Sergeyevich from the shipyard stands on a wooden crate that serves as an improvised podium, addressing maybe 30 neighbors about forming a local committee to coordinate food distribution and maintain order during the transition. The courtyard has been transformed for the occasion. Someone has strung lanterns between the windows, creating pools of warm light that make the gathering feel both festive and serious. "We did this," he says, his breath visible in the cold air, his words carrying the weight of someone who still can't quite believe what has happened. Not the politicians, not the army, not the secret police. We, the people, changed the government of the largest country on earth, simply by deciding we were tired of being hungry, tired of being ignored, tired of accepting that things had to be the way they were. But what comes next? Asks Anna Viktorovna, her seamstress's practical nature, focusing on the immediate challenges. We got rid of the old government, but we still need governance. We still need organization, coordination, decision-making processes. That's exactly what we're here to discuss, Dmitry replies. How do we organize ourselves? How do we make sure everyone gets fed? Everyone stays warm. Everyone has a voice in decisions that affect them. An older man you recognize from the bread lines raises his hand. I worked for the city administration for 20 years before they cut my position. I know how food distribution is supposed to work when it works. Maybe I can help organize that. My wife teaches arithmetic, offers another neighbor. She could help with the accounting, make sure resources are distributed fairly. "I know how to fix things," says a woman whose calloused hands support her claim. Pipes, stoves, electrical connections. Infrastructure doesn't maintain itself. Revolution or no revolution. The conversation that follows reveals capabilities that have been hidden by the rigid hierarchy of the old system. People who were treated as interchangeable workers turn out to have specialized knowledge and skills. Neighbors who barely spoke to each other before discover they have complementary abilities that could solve problems no individual could handle alone. The applause that follows is warm but subdued, not because people aren't excited, but because the magnitude of what's happened is still sinking in. You've participated in overthrowing a dynasty that ruled Russia for 300 years. The Romanov line, which survived Napoleon and revolution and war and famine, has ended during your lifetime. partly because you and your neighbors decided to ask for bread and refused to accept no as an answer. As the meeting continues, you listen to neighbors you've known for years reveal themselves as political thinkers, as organizers, as people who have been quietly developing ideas about how society should work while waiting in bread lines and sharing meals in communal kitchens. The revolution, you realize, didn't create these capabilities, it simply revealed them, providing the opportunity for people to show what they were capable of when given the chance. Vera Semyonovna, the elderly woman who lost her husband in the Japanese War, stands to address the group. "I've lived through 3 Tsars," she says, her voice carrying clearly in the cold air. Nicholas II, Alexander III, and the end of Alexander II. Each one promised to care for the people. Each one forgot that promise the moment it became inconvenient. She pauses, looking around at faces illuminated by the flickering light of improvised torches and candles at neighbors who have become fellow citizens in the space of a few days. Maybe it's time to stop waiting for someone else to care for us. Maybe it's time to care for ourselves. The suggestion generates animated discussion about practical matters: how to organize food distribution, how to maintain heat and light in the building, how to handle disputes and coordinate with other buildings and neighborhoods. These aren't abstract political theories, they're immediate practical problems that require immediate practical solutions. "We need committees," suggests Pavel Mikhailovich, his bureaucratic experience making him think in terms of organization and procedure. Food committee, maintenance committee, security committee, coordination committee to work with other buildings. Committees elected by everyone in the building, adds Maria Petrovna firmly. Not appointed by someone in authority, but chosen by the people who have to live with the consequences of their decisions. And rotating positions suggests the young mother with the baby who has brought her child to the meeting wrapped in blankets. No one person should hold power too long. Keep authority flowing through the community instead of getting concentrated in a few hands. The discussion continues late into the evening, covering everything from the practical mechanics of organizing communal kitchens to the philosophical questions about how decisions should be made when people disagree. It's messy and complex and sometimes confusing, but it's also exhilarating, the discovery that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary organization when they have both the necessity and the opportunity to do so. As you prepare for sleep that night, you think about tomorrow's challenges and the challenges that will come after tomorrow. The provisional government promises much but controls little beyond the major cities. The war with Germany continues draining resources and lives at an unsustainable rate. The economic problems that sparked the revolution haven't been solved, merely acknowledged. Regional separatist movements are beginning to assert independence, threatening to tear the empire apart. There will be disagreements about what the new Russia should look like, conflicts between different visions of freedom and justice, practical problems of governing a vast empire in the middle of a devastating war. Some of the people who helped overthrow the Tsar will discover they have very different ideas about what should replace him. Democracy, it turns out, is harder than revolution because revolution only requires people to agree on what they're against, while democracy requires them to agree on what they're for. But tonight, none of that feels overwhelming. Tonight, you fall asleep in a country where the people have discovered their own power, where ordinary citizens have learned they can change history, where the impossible has revealed itself to be merely difficult. Tonight you fall asleep knowing that whatever challenges tomorrow brings, you won't face them alone. You'll face them as part of a community that has proven it can survive hunger and cold and war and political upheaval through the simple expedient of caring for each other, for each. In your small apartment with the icon of St. Nicholas still watching over you, though now it feels more like a blessing on new beginnings than a plea for divine intervention, you listen to the sounds of a city learning to govern itself. Conversations float through the walls, excited voices planning everything from tomorrow's food distribution to next year's elections. The sound of people discovering that democracy is not something that happens to them, but something they do themselves. The revolution has begun the long work of creating a society where dignity is universal, where basic necessities are rights rather than privileges, where the people who do the work of society have a voice in how that society is organized. It won't be easy, and it won't happen quickly, and there will be setbacks and disappointments and moments when the old ways of doing things seem simpler than the new ways being invented. But the revolution has also proven that change is possible, that ordinary people possess extraordinary power when they choose to exercise it together, that the future belongs to those who have the courage to imagine it differently and the persistence to make their imagination reality. And in your dreams you taste not just bread, but the even sweeter flavor of possibility. The knowledge that tomorrow's bread will come from a system organized by people who understand hunger, distributed by people who have waited in lines, governed by people who know what it means to hope for better and work to achieve it. The revolution continues not as a single dramatic event, but as the daily work of creating a world where dignity is universal, where justice is practical, where the future belongs to everyone who helps build it. And so ends our journey through the Russian Revolution. As you drift off to sleep, may you carry with you the warmth of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, the knowledge that change is always possible when enough people decide it's necessary, and the peaceful certainty that tomorrow, whatever it brings there, will be bread for those who need it, and roses too for those who dare to dream of beauty alongside justice.